Hi everybody, this is Derek Murphy. I'm doing a live kind of chat, a very informal introduction to how to write good books. This is a huge topic, and I'm only bringing it up now because I just relaunched one of my earlier books, which is How to Write and Publish on a Budget. This was meant as kind of a self-publishing basic guide where I introduced all of the ways that you can write, format, publish, and promote your book for free or low cost. It first came out in like 2013 or 14, and I just went through and revised it because not only have I learned a lot, but there's a lot of big changes that weren't available 5 or 10 years ago, or big changes with the Amazon ecosystem that's only happened recently. So I've tried to go back and update the book to have more actionable updated information so I can be comfortable sharing it. There's a bunch of links in there. There's a bunch of my own tools and other resources that you probably have not heard about yet. And I'll tell you a little bit about this book. When I first started writing books, I was just focusing on the how-to. So I would just share information, and people liked them enough. I mean, they're not well-written books. It's not good writing, but there's valuable content. So there's like 140 reviews on there. And interestingly enough, later we're going to talk about editing, but one of the reviews I have on that book points out all of the grammatical mistakes that someone had found in the first edition, and they like highlighted them with a red pen. And so that's still up there. And so there's a difference between little grammar mistakes and actual good content, and you can have mistakes and still have a good book. So in this talk, we're going to talk about how to write a good book and the definition of good and what it means to write well, and why writing well doesn't really matter. It gets really messy, and I've had this discussion so many times. And the reason is there's a lot of other people who talk about writing or teach writing, and there's a huge divide between what's popular and what sells, what readers want to read, and what writers are writing. So the vast majority of writers are writing books that nobody wants to read, and then they're trying to sell them, which is why marketing doesn't work. So we're also going to cover tomorrow formatting, cover design, marketing, promotion, and all that stuff is important, but it starts with having a good book. And so the definition that I would like to recommend for you to think about, at least for a good book, is that the market decides quality based on reader satisfaction. So you might think it's really good. If you define a good book as you wrote what you wanted to write and you enjoyed the writing process, then that's fine for you. But there's also less fear of putting out a book that nobody likes. If you're not trying to make a book that people like, there's less anxiety, and that can be really helpful if you're trying to write your first book and get it out there. But then if you actually want it to sell, there's a huge disconnect between the book you've written or the book that you want to write and the book that people enjoy reading. And there's a way to write books that people enjoy reading. There's a universal system. There are rules to story structure for both fiction and nonfiction, which I've been diving into deep the last few months. I'm really excited about my next book, which is Bookcraft, because I'm going to share a lot of really valuable practical writing tips. But I can't really do that yet because it starts with mindset. And if you don't intend to write books that readers want to read, it's going to be difficult to even listen to the things that I'm going to be sharing in my next book. So this book it's not a book about writing. I focus a little bit about the productivity or, how to get the writing done. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to offer 3 things that are important to keep in mind when you're writing your book. But first, I really want to focus on the mindset. By the way, you can post comments and I should be able to see them, whether you're on YouTube or Facebook. If so, I'll try to reply. Otherwise, I'm just going to kind of loosely talk about what I have in mind. Some of this is in this book, but it's not the detailed steps to plotting or story architecture, because I have another book on that, and it's such a bigger topic. The book I'm writing, Bookcraft, is already really big, and it's going to get much bigger because there's so much content that writers need to learn if they want to write better books. But it goes back to the email I just sent out, which is how to write good. And of course, I already got someone writing back saying, well, to start with, I would want to write well. I wouldn't want to write good, because that's, a grammar mistake, which was the point of the email that I sent. And the point was basically, when we're talking about writing well, we're not talking about the sentence structure or the word choice or the punctuation. The difference I've said before between literary fiction and commercial fiction is that literary authors focus more on the individual words and the writing. So they think they are good writers because the sentences are beautiful, the prose is beautiful. And so they decide like where every comma belongs is really important, because if you're speaking out loud, it's the rhythm of the writing, it's how things would sound, which is fun if you're a writer. It's fun to focus on the, sentence level prose, but that stuff doesn't really matter. That stuff can be an addition, a valuable addition that some readers will appreciate, but it won't make up for poor structure or poor content. If you don't have a story that people want to read, or if you're not giving valuable information. And so real quick, switching back and forth between fiction and nonfiction, fiction is all about story. So you have to have a story worth telling, and you have to do it in a way that lets readers trust that you know what you're doing. So the writing craft is important, because if you make big mistakes, and I'll talk in a minute about what those big mistakes are, but if you make big mistakes in the first couple chapters, people will never read to the end. There are things you can learn, because most amateur writers or most first-time writers will write the way that seemed easy. If you're just trying to figure things out, if you're writing your first novel, you're going to do things that, the shortest path to something you've never done before, if you don't have the experience or the practice to do better, you're just going to write down the story and you're going to make mistakes. And those are easily identifiable and fixable red flags. These are the reasons that readers will quit, that agents will give up on a manuscript in the first couple of pages. You can learn to avoid the red flags on purpose if you want to. And that's kind of a sentence by sentence write craft kind of thing. But even if you do that well, you still have to have the story go somewhere. It still has to be a story worth telling, so they don't get lost or bored somewhere in the middle before they get to the ending. For nonfiction, it's actually really interesting, because you are probably trying to communicate information, whether you're trying to, generally, I think nonfiction should try to make a positive change in a reader's life. So not only are you teaching them things, but you have to get them to keep paying attention and also trust that you know what you're talking about and that the transformation you're promising is possible for them. So there are things you can do in a nonfiction book, which I haven't done myself in a lot of my nonfiction books. I'm getting a little better with this book, for example. A lot of it, like I said earlier, is just content, but I went back and I added a little bit of story, a little bit more, poignant writing, phrases and things, because the content is really interesting, but people also want to see that you're a good writer. They also want to trust that you know what you're talking about. And you can do things in nonfiction by building sympathy or trust, by sharing stories. And because if you're not getting readers to pay attention to what you're talking about, they're not going to remember the information. It's also a matter of, you want to be putting pictures in their minds so that they feel a certain way about you, the author, and your author brand, and also about the information. Because if it's just an info dump, they're not going to remember it and they may not take action. Whereas if you tell stories and you get things to settle in their minds so that they feel a certain way and they remember it later, they're more likely to take action. That stuff's really important for nonfiction. I don't think it's been taught well anywhere. So I'm excited to have more of that in Bookcraft. I've done 2 courses on writing fiction now, and I'm going to do a new one just about nonfiction. If you pre-order Bookcraft, you get those 3 $197 courses. So it's like $600 worth of courses for $399, which is the price I'm charging to pre-order the book. And I'm only doing that because I think this book is going to be really good, and I really want to get to 1,000 pre-orders before I launch. I'm about halfway there. But anyway, some things I want to talk about in this video about writing. The only thing that really matters is whether you exceed reader expectations. So if you want to write a good book, it means somebody besides you, some readers, have to like the book that you've written. You can do that accidentally if you just write what you want and you hope that it gets discovered or whatever, but you're not really going to know how to put your book in front of the right audience unless you know who your audience is, and you're not really going to be able to satisfy the audience unless you know what they're expecting. So meeting and exceeding reader expectation is my definition of how to write a good book. Lots of people will disagree with that because other people are telling you that you shouldn't worry about the market, you shouldn't write to market, you shouldn't consider sales or reviews or anything, which can be good advice when you're in the productive. Well, I don't think it's good advice. It can free you from creative anxiety because you're not worried about the reception of the work, which may allow you to finish the work, especially if it's your first book and you're having trouble finishing it. The problem is finishing a book doesn't mean it's a good book, especially if you're worried about the writing quality of the individual sentences or the punctuation, and it just doesn't hold together. It doesn't satisfy readers. If your book doesn't satisfy readers, it doesn't matter how much you market it, you're not going to get the reviews and it's not going to continue selling. So marketing aside or promotion aside, it really starts with, finding who your audience is and what they like and how you can satisfy them. If you are aiming at a particular genre, you have to read the genre and know the tropes and the cliches. And a lot of writers will say, I don't want cliches and tropes in my book. But the thing is, cliches and tropes are functions of genre. And so in any genre, I don't know if you've read Sean Coyne's Story Grid, but in any particular genre, there are rules that readers are looking for and expect. And if you aren't doing those things, your book doesn't belong in that genre. So if you're pitching it as a dystopian young adult sci-fi thriller, and your book isn't doing those things that the other books in that category are doing, readers will buy it expecting one thing, and they will be disappointed because you're not providing the same kind of reading experience, which is going to mess up your reviews. Even if you have a good book, even if the writing is good, even if the story is good, if you're not meeting the reader expectation, the readers don't think it's good. And by good, it's such a messy definition. In Bookcraft, which is my next book, I have a huge section on creative confidence and the importance of writing to market, where I can really dig into a lot of this stuff in greater detail. But the important thing to remember is not only is it easier to write a good book if you aim to satisfy reader expectations, but also it'll be easier to sell the book later because you know who your audience is. So real quick, I wanted to read this quote from, I don't know if you know Stephen Pressfield of The War of Art. It's a really popular book. I actually have a long article on my blog, Creative Indie, which is nobody wants to read shit, because most people have read The War of Art, but they forget all of the significantly negative passages that upset me, that I think are limiting to authors. And so what I did was I deconstructed The War of Art, and then Sean Coyne's Story Grid. He's Stephen Pressfield's author. He had a big hand in creating The War of Art. And then Nobody Wants to Read Your Shit is Stephen Pressfield's more recent book, which basically says you have to write to market. You have to follow universal rules of story architecture. There are, rules for organizing your fiction content that are important. And if you want to write a successful story, if you want to write a good book, you have to follow these rules. Fewer people have read that book. Everybody loves The War of Art. In The War of Art, Stephen Pressfield says, the artist committing himself to his calling has volunteered for hell. Whether he knows it or not, he will be dining for the duration on a diet of isolation, rejection, self-doubt, despair, ridicule, contempt, and humiliation. So in that quote, and in a lot of the quotes that I put in the new edition of How to Write and Publish on a Budget, there's a lot of famous quotes that talk about how hard writing is and how writing is, torture and it's difficult. And you have to suffer through it for your art. If you're passionate enough about it, if you love your story enough, if you believe in it, you're going to sweat it out, even though it's, you're in hell. Parts of that is true because there are realistic expectations when you're doing any creative content. When you're creating something from scratch and you're going to put it out into the world, it's always a little bit scary. There's going to be anxiety and fear. I have a section in Bookcraft about the difference between creative confidence and creative courage and how to get rid of a lot of that creative anxiety. But my point is that you only feel this overwhelming sense of anxiety because you're writing into the dark without any kind of a structure, without any kind of market research to find out if your book is even going to be successful. So while you're writing it, you don't know if it's any good. You hope it's good. You think it's good, but you have no external validation until after you publish. And in most of the time, when people publish their first few novels or books, they are disappointed because they can't get anybody to review it. They think it's good, but nobody else thinks so. And there's this huge disconnect. I think it also just frustrates me that, the reason the War of Art is so popular is that it kind of creates a cult mentality where it tells you if you are frustrated and suffering, that's great. You're a true artist. Doesn't matter if you're making any money. He actually says if you try to make money, if you think about the market, you're a hack, you're selling out, you're a prostitute. Another literal quote that most people don't remember from the War of Art is that he calls people who write with the market in mind prostitutes, prostitution, not to mention that it's a derogatory view of sex work, which is already shifting in modern times. But it's a weird thing where only writers are accused of selling out because it's assumed that writers have to be focused on pure, blissful inspiration and creative process. And if they aren't fully inspired, if they're not doing it for the right reasons, then even if the work is technically good, there is no value because they've sold the soul of the piece. That's pretty common in books that talk about writing, and it's very inspirational and motivational, but it doesn't help you write good books. It might help you to feel understood as the starving, frustrated, struggling writer who feels like this is really hard. Books like that can help you to feel understood, but they don't give you a game plan for actually finishing a good book. And fortunately or unfortunately, there are definitely rules to writing good books. So if you read The War of Art, you should also read Nobody Wants to Read Your Shit, or on Creativity, look up Nobody Wants to Read Your Shit, which is an article. I think I might have linked to it inside of the new edition. I linked to a lot of my articles and resources in the book. So I'll mention one more time, the PDF is available that you can download on the link that should be below this video. And it's up on Kindle for $1.99. There's a lot of images in it, so I couldn't discount it more, and I can't give it away for free because it's not in KU and it's not perma-free. It's still a reasonably dense book with a lot of detailed content. So for $1.99, it's still a good deal. There's 140 reviews. I would love to see some reviews on the new edition because I think it's better than the old edition. If you do read it, I hope you'll review it. Also, I'd love to see some pictures of the inside. I tried to make it look a little bit nicer. I did some formatting with fonts and stuff, which didn't really work very well with the ebook version. I have to go back and fix the ebook version because the fonts didn't embed. So right now it kind of looks weird. But if you have the PDF on a device, or if you download the ebook version and you see any quotes or sections that you want to share, if you can take pictures of those and add those to your reviews on Amazon, that would also be helpful. Let me shift to, if you have any questions, by the way, about writing in general, you can post them. Someone just commented, the key to finding a balance between the market and what you enjoy writing. And yes, that's actually a really good prompt because I have some things to say about that. I have said in the past, compromise is not the right approach because, and I'll talk in a minute about, okay, I'll start here. You can write a bad book readers love and a good book readers hate, which means you can write what people define as a bad book might be like not good writing, amateur writing, like Twilight, for example, was not good, or Shades of Grey was not good. A lot of people who consider themselves good writers would say that's low bar, bad writing for the greatest common denominator. But a lot of people loved those books. You can also write a good book, a technically proficient, beautiful writing book that's really meaningful that nobody likes because it just isn't a satisfying story. Your sentences don't matter if readers aren't loving the story. The important part of story, besides structure and plotting, which is a big part of it, is suspense and intrigue, which means, and I did an interview yesterday, day before, there's going to be a fiction online writing summit next week, which I did an interview for, which was really good. And we did a really deep dive on how to create intrigue and suspense, because people read fiction especially to find out what happens next, which means you have to make your characters likable, there has to be stakes and danger, and then you have to withhold information. So I actually have a plan for when to reveal crucial information in your novel. At 25%, you focus on the what is actually happening and you reveal some of those answers. At 50%, you focus on who is behind this, who's the antagonist, or who am I when you get to the midpoint of the protagonist and they're deciding whether or not this conflict is worth their struggle or whether they are the right person for this struggle. And then at 75%, you're finally getting into the why, backstory. And the important part of this is because most authors don't understand. They feel like they have to tell readers why all this stuff is happening. So they start out in the first couple chapters with massive info dumps or flashbacks or backstory. Readers don't care about that stuff yet because they're not invested in the story yet. The story has to start with action and suspense and danger, something happening, because only when you show the character responding to plot events and readers start to care what is happening to the scene and the character, and then what's going to happen next. Once you have them on the hook, once they're invested in the story, then you can reveal the backstory information. I went through a whole hour presentation with slides. There's some really good stuff on that. So I'll tell you next week about that online fiction writing summit. It's a lot of the same material that's in my writing course on fiction that I did this summer and is now relaunching, which you can get for free if you pre-order Bookcraft. But to this point, which is the key to finding balance between the market and what you enjoy writing, if you try to compromise and you say, I'm going to write what I want and I'm also going to write to market, you're probably not going to satisfy anybody. You'll probably be a little bit unhappy because you have to write to market, and you might be a little bit, the readers may not be fully happy. You don't want to half-ass when you're writing to market. You don't want to kind of try to write a vampire dystopia, but actually write something totally different that doesn't hit the genre at all, because then you're asking readers to make a huge leap to follow you on a journey into speculative fiction, which is not what they signed up for, unless you're very clear about the experience. But even then, it's harder to get them on board to trust you to finish the book if you're not writing hardcore commercial fiction. So by hardcore, I mean you're fully assimilating the tropes and the plot devices and the cliches and the devices that are common in that genre. Because the more you over-identify, it doesn't mean you're copying anybody else. It doesn't mean you're formulaic. You can write an amazing book that also hits all the right things for that genre. You want to meet and over-deliver. So you want to meet all the expectations and then over-deliver with something new and different and exciting. That's the easier way to write a good book. But I also said something in this book about, I posted a long quote, which was something about, it's better to write a bad book on purpose when you're starting out, because if you try to write a good book, then your heart's going to be in it. You're going to be overextended and too worried about trying to make it perfect. And you're never going to write a perfect book your first time around. Your first 5 or 10 books might just be practice. It's obscene to assume your first book is going to be amazing, because people who have written lots of books for many years finally get better. Like anything else, it's a craft. It's a skill that you improve with practice. When you try to make your first book the best book, and you worry too much about, making it perfect, even if you haven't hit the major overarching, genre considerations or marketing concerns, you may think it's really good, but you're spending too much time on something that nobody really wants. And so my advice in the book was, you might want to start off aiming to write a bad book. And by bad book, I only mean something that's unabashedly commercial. So you're trying to write something commercial because you think, it's not my life's work. It's not my passion project. I'm just going to see, rather than trying to write a million copy universal bestseller, literary bestseller, see if you can just write a shitty vampire novel. See if you can write a shitty contemporary romance. You have to aim lower. And the funny thing is, if you aim lower and just try to over conform with genre expectations, you actually have a much better shot at writing a book people like to read. This can be really frustrating if you consider yourself a good writer. Some of my books that I like, that I think are really good, people don't like them as much. The ones that I wrote quickly to market and put in all the cliches and all the tropes that I could, those are the ones that perform better. Those are the ones that readers like and agree with. Anyway, so I got kind of off topic, but I was trying to answer that question. I see there's a lot of new questions coming in, which is great. Someone's desperately trying to avoid info dumps. It's so important, but it's not something I can really talk about in this video because it's a whole thing. I have a whole slide presentation. Next week, there's a fiction summit where you can go and watch that interview, because it's really good, and we go really deep on, how to make sure your first couple chapters are good. I'm going to make another video about editing where we'll also talk a little bit more about those things. But let me really quick wrap this one up with 3 main things. So if you're talking about how to write a book, how to write a good book, I already talked about market and reader expectation. I don't think you can kind of half-ass it. I think you have to go. I have a problem with mixing my metaphors, but the opposite of cold turkey, whole donkey or whatever, like you have to go all in with trying to write books for the market on purpose. You can, of course, still love your books. You can, of course, still write whatever turns you on. I write all of my stuff, like I hit all the young adult tropes and cliches, but I also throw in a ton of historical trivia and Greek mythology and deep research that nobody else knows about. Readers don't necessarily care about that stuff. I love it. It doesn't necessarily make my books better to have that historical research in there, and it makes them harder to write, but that's what I enjoy. So I'm really proud of my books. I like my writing, but I'm also trying to write books that readers enjoy, and that makes it easier to know whether or not I'm hitting the mark or missing the mark, because I get real feedback from actual people. And so that was my main point, is that you have to write good books, you have to write books that other people like. Other people are the mark of whether or not you're doing well or not. What's not the mark is grammar stuff, because I've had a lot of people criticize me for telling me I'm a bad writer, because I have been an editor. I got my PhD in literature. I'm a developmental editor, so I focus on big picture story stuff. I can find your story and I can fix it, because there's going to be problems with it. I can pull out all the threads. I can tighten everything. I can rewrite it to make it better, because there's a way to tell a story that sucks readers in, that keeps readers reading, which is really the only important thing. It's also true that I'm sloppy with punctuation and grammar. I don't think it's that important. Even with my PhD thesis or master's degree, I've written and published over 2 million words of content. I publish a lot of stuff on my blogs, but I'm definitely not a clean writer. I have problems with commas and hyphens, using hyphens in the right place. And I make spelling mistakes or typos sometimes. I don't worry about that so much. Yes, it's important to be clean, and I should have a better process in place for making sure my content is clean before I publish, but it's not the most important thing. Clean is not good. You can have a very clean book that's not good. You can have a well-written book that's not good. The thing that makes it good is the market and the reader expectation. Final comment on that. One of my books, I accidentally, I didn't know what to put in my blurb and my tagline. So on the top of the tagline, I had something really heavy romance, like, an alien romance or whatever. But that first book didn't actually have a romance. The romance really comes into play in the second book. So that tagline set a false reader expectation. So I got some negative reviews by people who expected romance, and then they said, the book was good, but 2 or 3 star because this was not a romance. I told them something different. Anyway, so I think I get something similar with writing. When I talk about writing or I talk about publishing, especially because I recommend writing quickly and focusing on productivity and not necessarily, your revision or editing process, which is important. I'm going to make another video next hour. We're going to talk all about that stuff because it is important, but it's not the main thing. Anyway, after that, after the reader expectation, after the market, there are 3 things: structure, execution, productivity. That's what you need to write the book. So the first one with structure is just how you set it up. I've actually done pretty well about figuring out what makes a story tick and how to turn it into a template. A lot of people don't like templates because they want, the freedom to just write their story. And that can totally work if you're a seat of the pants writer, a pantser, and you just want to write. That's sometimes more satisfying and more rewarding. And if you're a good writer, you can write a good book that way. I think it's easier for me, especially, to write with a template in mind so that I know, at least with the plot dot, which is a simple 8-point structure, I know I'm hitting those major turning points. I know what's got to happen in my story. Those are mostly universal for all kinds of commercial fiction. I also have a 24-chapter outline that goes even deeper, which can be used to map out a new story, or it can be used to fix your story after you've written a rough draft and you're trying to, you've basically got the story, but you know that it's weak, especially in the middle, because no other plotting resources really tell you what to do in the middle of your book. There's a lot of advice about writing, but nobody else really tells you exactly what to do in your book. So I'm proud of the writing resources that I've made because I think they're pretty good, but that's just structure. It's not enough. For nonfiction, we had a question about nonfiction. In my book, Bookcraft, it's going to be about fiction and nonfiction. So I have a 12-week process for writing fiction. I've made a new 12-week process for writing nonfiction also, which I haven't really shared yet. So that's going to be pretty cool. And it's difficult, with structure. I can't really give a universal structure for nonfiction because that can vary so much. But there are definitely things you need to do in your preface and introduction. There are ways to organize your chapters. So there's a lot of content about organization and structure in my resources in Bookcraft and in the writing courses that I've made. But it's important to have some structure if you're writing a book because it'll let you know if you're going the right way. You can always veer off course, and you don't have to write the scenes that you had planned. You can always find better scenes, but it's so that you kind of know the general direction that you're going, even if your writing isn't that great. If you hit the right turning points and you have a strong structure, you could still have a really good book, even if you have bad writing, which is why I think structure is so valuable because it's kind of like training wheels. In the beginning, you may not be a great writer. The other thing that structure really helps with is a lot of people will write a first draft and the structure will be broken. It's really difficult to go back and fix a story that doesn't have the structure and try to make it make sense. You can clean up the writing, you can edit it and revise it. People often spend, years revising their manuscripts. it would have been easier to revise with less editing if you had had more structure. And I think you can finish a book more quickly. So especially if you don't have a lot of experience writing books, no matter what feels comfortable for you, I think structure can really help to improve your writing. But it's not the only thing. It's one thing that helps. The other thing that's really important, like I talked about earlier, is the conflict. There has to be conflict everywhere. I have 3 points of conflict that I like to use. I have a scene checklist that I like to use. And then you have to have intrigue, which is about information management. It's about not revealing all the information too early, but allowing your characters to ask the right questions at the right time so that your readers keep reading to find out the answers. The other part, structure, execution, productivity. The other part is execution, which just means getting the writing done. My personal process now, I've tried all sorts of things. I've tried Scrivener. I've tried a lot of like online writing tools. The only things that I really use are a Bluetooth keyboard with IA Writer, which is an iPhone app. I don't have it handy, actually. I have a lot of Bluetooth keyboards lying around, but I don't have the one that I use the most, which is a tiny little lightweight Belkin Bluetooth keyboard. It's super thin. It's really easy to carry. Let me see if I can grab it. Yeah, so this is what I use. It folds. Mine's a little broken, but it looks like that. Anyway, I put my iPhone or my iPad in there. I prefer my iPhone because it's a smaller screen. So I write with IA Writer with a dark screen. The small screen allows you to focus better when you're writing. What happens in this scene? Then I have to block everything out. And there are some really cool research stuff. There's another site called ILIS. And the founder of that site on a cruise ship gave me the prototype of a little device he made where basically you would type in your Bluetooth keyboard and the words would go in the dark. They would go into this device. There's no screen. And I've actually tried closing your eyes and typing, or just having the reduced screen size with only 1 or 2 lines at a time. You basically want to block out all distractions, and you want to get into the visualization of the scene so that you can really see it without worrying about the whole manuscript. So for drafting, I think that's really important to get the words out if you just want to boost your productivity time. Sprints also work really well. I have this amazing little timer. It's a 30-minute timer that just lights up. So the light goes on for 30 minutes. And when it's done, it kind of makes me feel like I'm on air and I've got to be writing. So I do that. A lot of people have success with online writing sprints where they'll write with partners or other people at the same time, which can work really well. Also, just so that you have some accountability with other people. Someone asked if I'm making another book cover vid. Not right now. I'll talk about book covers tomorrow. I'm going to do a ton of book cover stuff soon because book cover stuff has changed so much in the past couple of years. And not only am I better as a designer, but the competition is so much greater, especially for sci-fi and fantasy. You can get such quality design now that you couldn't get a couple of years ago. Someone asked about Grammarly. I'll talk about that in the next video because I'm going to talk about editing. Let me finish up real quick. Someone asked, is it normal to get caught in editing and wanting to cut everything out and then put it back in? Yes, editing is hard. For me, I have a 3-step editing process. So I'm going to talk about editing in the next video. I'm going to stop this in about 5 minutes and we'll take a break and then I'll come back with a video just about editing. But with the writing stuff, because I got kind of distracted with what I was talking about. Anyway, basically, if you're just writing, that's what I use. I use IA Writer with my iPhone and a Bluetooth keyboard and time sprints. I can write, 500 to 1,000 words in a time sprint. Probably 500 words in a 30-minute sprint would be like a low bar, reasonable expectation, which means if I did, 6 sprints a day, which is about 3 hours, I could write a few thousand words. If you write a few thousand words a day, you have 60,000 words a month. Then it's the editing and revision process. I'm a really heavy editor. I do 3 to 7 different rounds of revision after I've put down the words in the first rough draft. But my first rough draft is also really clean because I know how my structure goes together, and I don't have to do major revisions to moving everything around. My book always gets much better in the revision process, but I don't have like major, deleting whole scenes or chapters. So that's mostly what I wanted to talk about in this video. Let me check if there was one more thing that I had missed. Structure, execution, productivity were my 3 things about how to write a good book. So that was just the execution part. After I write the words, I would take those words, I'd put them up in Dropbox or whatever, and I would probably put them in Microsoft Word. I tend to edit in Microsoft Word. I format books in Microsoft Word. I like Microsoft Word because I can have the navigation pane and I can drag and drop all my sections around. And I can also have all my notes and comments on the side. So when I'm reading down and revising, I'll also add comments and questions to myself. So it's a process of like reading it and commenting and then going back and revising back and forth. So I haven't found another software I like better than Microsoft Word for the editing and revision phase. And for me, I spend at least as much time in the editing and the revision as I do in the writing, maybe more. But I feel more comfortable in the editing and the revising phases. It's harder for me to get into the writing, the new words. Anyway, I'm going to stop this video here. If you have questions, you can still let me know. And then I'll come back in about 15 minutes and we'll just talk about editing and revision, because it is a big part of it. Writing, getting the words down is a big first step. But I also do a lot of the work, like the detail work, the description, the motivation. Like when I focus on the first rough draft, I'm only focused on the what actually happens to make it a good book. A lot of the heavy lifting I do in the revision phase, where I'm going back, not only cleaning up. I mean, editing is not just cleaning up the typos and the punctuation. It's increasing the emotional pathos. It's getting reader buy-in. It's tightening all the threads of your story so that there's more drama and conflict and suspense. So I'll talk more about that in the next video. Thanks. Bye-bye.